Hey guys! From the very beginning, when I started using VCV Rack, Rampage was there for me. When I needed a simple envelope generator, or when I wanted some weird modulation in my patch, or even when I wanted to add some distortion to the sound and make it squeal. So this video is all about Rampage. Let's start. Okay, so here it is, Rampage from Befaco. We will start by looking at all the different sections of Rampage, with examples for each section of course, and there will be also timestamp links in the description to all the different parts, and also a link to all the different patches. Now, Rampage is a function generator slash processor, which means that it can do all sorts of cool stuff like generating envelopes, slew limiting, low pass filtering, and so on. We have two identical function generators, and in each section we have two inputs, a signal input and a trigger input. We have range switches for changing the working and processing speed. We have trigger buttons to manually trigger the function generators. We have shape control knobs for changing the shape from linear to exponential and logarithmic. We have the balance knob, and we will see what it's doing in a second. Then we have the rise and fall sliders, or attack and decay, for controlling the rise and fall times. And both have dedicated CV inputs and also an exponential CV input for controlling both rise and fall. And the interesting thing about this input is that it's actually inverted. So the more voltage coming in, the shorter the rise and fall times will be. Then we have rising and falling gate outputs, which will output a gate each time the function generators enter the respective phase. So when it's in the rising phase, a gate will come out of the rising output, and the same will go for the falling phase. When it's in falling phase, a gate will come out of this output. Now in the middle we have the five main outputs. Out A and B are the respective outputs of both function generators, and let's see for a second how everything works. So let's use for now output A, connect it to the scope, and you can see if I trigger it manually, we get a really short and snappy envelope or function. We can change the rise and fall times. Let's have the scope a bit like this, very nice. So we have short attack and a longer decay or fall or release. We can change the shape, so in this case all the way left the rise will be exponential with the curve inwards, and the fall will be logarithmic with the curve outwards. And the other way around, the attack or the rise will have a logarithmic curve with the curve outwards, and the fall will have an exponential curve with the curve inwards. Now again we have CV inputs for rise and fall and the exponential, but we have also the gate outputs here, the rising and falling. So if we have a longer rise time, and we see what's coming out of the rising gate output, and I trigger this, you can see that as long as the envelope is in a rising phase, we get a gate. So if we have a shorter rise time, we get a shorter gate or a smaller gate. And the same goes for the falling phase. So let's have a longer attack or a longer rise. And you can see when it enters the falling phase, we have a gate. Now we have also the minimum and maximum outputs, and out of the minimum output we will get the minimum level of both sections together. So for this I will have to trigger both sections at once. And let's see what's going on in the minimum output. Let's change the functions a bit and trigger this. This I don't want to see. So this will be the minimum level that we get out of both outputs together. And out of the maximum output, we will get the maximum level of both sections together. So the red trace now will be the maximum. Let's have them a bit apart. And we can change the settings a bit and get really interesting envelopes or functions. Now we have another output, a comparator output, when B is greater than A, and from this output we will receive a gate as long as what comes out of the B output is greater than what comes out of the A output. So if we look at it on the scope, we can see all of this time in the gate, it means that B, what comes out of B is greater than what comes out of A. And we change the settings a bit. So you can see we get shorter gates. And here, minimum, maximum, and comparator are affected by the balance knob. So we can balance A and B and have different settings for the comparator and also for the minimum and maximum values, and play with it until we get something we like. Then we have cycle switches with dedicated CV inputs, so we can set each one of the function generators to cycle mode, and as soon as the falling phase comes to an end, the function generator will be re-triggered and loop its function. So for now, let's connect again A to the scope, and if I trigger it once, we can see we have an envelope or a function, and when I turn cycle on and I trigger it once, the function is looping and cycling, and we can use this for modulating audio rate signals, oscillators, and of course we can change also the range. So this is medium range. Let me take it out of cycle mode. So this is medium range. We have also short range, which is really short and snappy. Or we have a longer range, and we can set really long LFOs. You can see how slow they are. Now the last outputs we have are the end of cycle outputs, and from them we will receive a trigger whenever the function comes to an end. So when the falling phase ends, and we can use this to trigger different events or sounds, and also trigger the second function generator. So what we can do, we can take the triggers out and connect the end of cycle output from A to trigger B, and the end of cycle from B to trigger A. And when I trigger one of them, let's see this also on the scope. When I trigger one of them, they will trigger always the second one or the other function generator, and we get also a looping signal. Okay, so let's start by using Rampage as an envelope generator. Okay, so here we have the gate sequencer from Impromptu Modular. I have already some gates here set up, and it's also set on 2x 32-step sequence, so we have two separate sequences. And let's add two treasure oscillators from MSM. It's a really interesting oscillator with a sort of a wavetable sound to it. And of course we will change the skin to Fun Guy mode, because it's simply more fun. So let's have two of those, and let's take also the octaves down. Very nice. And let's add also, let's take them to the left here, let's add also the dual VCA from AS, take the levels already all the way up, and add of course Rampage. Okay, and let's send the oscillators through the VCA to the mixer and see how this sounds like. Let's open here the volume, take it down maybe a bit. Okay. So those are the oscillators. Okay, and let's see, let's trigger both sections of Rampage with the gate sequencer. So here we have the first sequence going to the trigger input of the A section, and the second sequence going to B section to trigger the B section. And let's send both outputs A and B to modulate the VCA. And now let's change the rise and fall times. Let's have a longer rise and a shorter fall in section A and the opposite in section B. So now we have a simple attack decay envelopes. Let's see this also on the scope. We have simple attack decay envelopes coming out of Rampage. And we can also use the minimum and maximum outputs to modulate the size of the waveform of the oscillators. So this is how it will look like on the scope, minimum and maximum. Let's take the size of the oscillators all the way down, of the waveform of the oscillators, and modulate them with the minimum and maximum, they look like this. You can see really interesting wave shapes. This will modulate the size of the waveforms. We can also change the shape of the envelope. So let's make this exponential attack or rise and logarithmic fall all the way to the left. And this will be the opposite. Very nice. And let's see how this sounds like. Okay, now let's have some change in pitch. So let's add 2 grid sequencers from JW modules. Let me just change here the range a bit, take it down, change the scale also, maybe D minor. Let's duplicate it so we have 2. And let's randomize the notes on both of them. Very nice, and run them with the sequencer. So this will be the first, this will run from the first sequence, this will run from the second sequence, and we can use them now to modulate the pitch of the oscillators. So we will take the output to the volt per octave input of the oscillators. Let's take the volume a bit up. Very nice. Now let's add another rampage. Okay, but this time use it as an ASR envelope. So we will have an attack, sustain and release. And for this we will need a gate, and the bigger the gate, the longer the sustain phase will be. Now for this we will have to send the gate to the signal input, because we want to process the signal and not just trigger the function generator. So let's use our clock. I have here a clock divided by 8. Let's use this to the input of section A, and I want to show you this also shortly on the scope. So if I take the clock, you can see it's a gate, and I have here the pulse width settings that I can change. If I take it down, we have a shorter gate, which means also a shorter sustain phase. But I will want a longer sustain phase, so I'll push the pulse width a bit upwards to around 3 o'clock, so we have a nice long gate. Okay, very nice. So now, let's see. Let's go old school and use the even VCO and tangents for this sound. Tangents from volt. Let's take the octaves a bit down. We can already send the sawtooth wave to the low pass input of tangents. Let's raise the resonance a bit, lower the cutoff just a bit. Very nice. Now we need also a VCA for this, so let's take the fundamental VCA. And the output A of Rampage, let's see also how this looks like on the scope. Output A of Rampage will modulate the VCA. This is how it looks like: attack, sustain, and release. So we have a 3-stage envelope. So let's use this to modulate the VCA and send tangents to the VCA and to the mixer. Very nice. nice. Now what we can also do is modulate the cutoff point of tangents with the second function generator of Rampage. So let's use the rising output of section A to trigger section B. So every time the first function generator is in rising phase, it will send out a gate, which in this case will trigger the second function generator. And we will use this signal to modulate the cutoff point of the filter. So this is how it looks like on the scope. And we shall connect it to the CV input of the cutoff of the filter and open the attenuator a bit. And let's change also the envelope to a bit longer rise and fall. Very cool. Okay, so we have an AD, attack decay envelope, and we have an ASR, attack sustain release envelope. And now let's see how we can use Rampage as an oscillator. Okay, so let's start by using Rampage as a low frequency oscillator. Now an oscillator, like an oscillator does, it oscillates, which means that we will have to use the cycle function of Rampage. And with using the rise and fall times, we can change the shape of the waveform and its frequency. So let's start by adding two FM operators. Very nice, and let's use output A of Rampage to modulate the level of the first oscillator and output B to modulate the level of the second oscillator. We will set the first function generator to cycle mode and trigger it. Let's see this also on the scope. Very nice. So this is output A, this is how it will look like. And let's create a nice slow LFO. So let's change the range speed to high, to slow, let's say, and change the rise time to somewhere here, for example, and the fall time to somewhere here, maybe a bit longer even. So we have a nice LFO, and let's use the falling output of section A to trigger section B. So each time the first LFO is in its falling phase, it triggers the second function generator and we get a sort of a signal delay effect. So let's see this also on the scope. And let's change also the function generator here, maybe a longer release. So you can see the first oscillator, low frequency oscillator, is falling, and the second one is starting, it's rising. Very nice, and let's see how this sounds like also. So let's connect the oscillators to the mixer. Okay, now we cannot really hear the difference because we don't have a change in pitch. So let's add ions from the geodesics collection, dark matter edition of course, and use both rising outputs of Rampage to drive the local inputs of ions. So whenever the LFO or the function generators are in their rising phase, the sequencer or the sequencers will go one step forward. So I take the first rising output to the blue local clock input of ions, and I will set it to run just from the local clock. Let's run it already, the sequencer. Let's do the same with the second function generator to the local clock input of the yellow sequence, and set it to run just from this clock. Very nice. Let's use also two quantizers from JW. Really simple and easy to use quantizers. Change the scale to D minor. Let's have 2. And let's send the voltage or the signal coming out from the sequences through the quantizers to the oscillators. So this was the blue sequence, this is the yellow one. And let's start changing the values of ions also to something like this. And we can also change, oh yes, this is nice. We can also change the range of the sequences by clicking this button here to change it to the lowest range. Okay, now let's use we have two more outputs of Rampage, minimum and maximum. Let's use them to modulate the feedback amount of the oscillators. Let's have a look also how they look like on the scope. So we get some nice funky shapes here. And we can use them to modulate the feedback amount of the oscillators. So let's do this. And open the attenuators a bit. Yes. Maybe something like this. Wow, yes, very nice. I will save this patch already. Again, there will be a link in the description to all the different patches. You can download them, take a closer look at them. Now let's add another Rampage. I will duplicate it and initialize it. And this time let's use it in audio rate. So let's change the speed of the function generators to fast in the middle. Let's set them to cycle mode and trigger them. And let's see this also on the scope. So here, for example, we have the first one. This is how it will look like. And we can tune now section A with the rise and fall slider. So let's use Hotuna from Nischi to tune this oscillator. We take the same output A, and let's tune this to C3. I'm clicking and holding control while moving the slider so I can fine-tune them. Let's do something like this. Very nice. This is C3. Excellent. Let's get rid of the scope also for now. Okay, and now we can also modulate the pitch of this oscillator. Let's shortly connect it to the mixer and see how it sounds like. Just like this, and let's modulate its pitch, and we will use the exponential CV input to modulate its pitch, this here, and let's use the grid sequencer from also from JW. Let's randomize the notes, change the range to almost all the way down. It's a bit tricky to modulate the pitch of Rampage as an oscillator, but it can be done. And we will do this now. Change the scale to D minor so it will fit to the other sequence we have. Let's drive it with a multiplied clock, a clock multiplied by 2. And what we have to do is send the pitch information, so what's coming out of the sequencer, to the exponential CV input. We will do this in a second. To the exponential CV input, which will control both rise and fall times at once. Now, if you remember, the exponential CV input is inverted, which means that with more voltage, the rise and fall times will decrease, will shorten, which will in this case mean higher pitch. And this is exactly what we want. We want that when the sequencer outputs higher notes, so more voltage, also the pitch of Rampage will go high. So let's see how this sounds like. Very nice. We can also randomize the notes. Well, let's use every clock divided by 8. So we get a different sequence all the time. Very nice. Now we can also output square waves by using the rising and falling gate output. So let's see this again on the scope. Remove the scope. Let's see this. The rising output will output square waves, also the falling one. So we can use this as a square wave oscillator, for example. And let's do this. Let's add tangents from volt. Let's take the resonance a bit up and the cutoff a bit down, maybe a bit more drive also, and send the rising output of section B to the low pass input of the filter. And let's actually tune this oscillator first before we send it to the mixer. Hotuna. Let's see, let's do it again to C3. So this is here C4, G3. Very nice. Okay, so now it's tuned to C3. And let's see, let's connect this to the mixer and see how this sounds like. Okay, now let's modulate its pitch with the signal coming out of the first quantizer, just for fun, again to the exponential CV input. Let's see if it works. Yes. Okay, now we will want to control the cutoff point of this filter or modulate it. So let's use another rampage. I will duplicate this one and initialize it. I will save the patch again. Very nice. And let's trigger its A section with a divided clock. So again, I have the same clock here divided by 8. Very nice. And set a nice envelope to modulate the cutoff point. So let's see. Let's have a longer rise and maybe a shorter fall, and take the output of this section to the CV input of the cutoff and open the attenuator a bit. Let's see. Yes. Yes. Okay, now of course it's maybe easier to just use a normal VCO instead of Rampage, but you can get some interesting results, and there are actually two more outputs that we can use, the minimum and maximum outputs. So we can use them for audio rate modulation, for example. So let's modulate the resonance of tangents and send the signal first through a VCA. So let's add a VCA from the fundamental modules, and I will use the minimum output. Again, I don't have the scope here. I will add again the scope. I keep removing it. I will add it again. I will add it again. Take the minimum output. And this is what we will get. And with this, we can modulate different parameters. So let's send this first to a VCA so we can control its range. And from the VCA to the resonance CV input, let's open the attenuator a bit, see how it sounds like. Something like this maybe. Haha, yes, very nice. Okay, now let's modulate the VCA with the B section, section B of Rampage. So let's take out B to the CV input of the VCA, and we will use the rising output of section A to trigger section B. So every time or each time this function generator is in the rising phase, it will trigger section B. And let's have a nice, let's say a long rise and a shorter fall, or a longer fall even. Let's see how this sounds like. Yes. Very nice. Now we can use also the maximum output here. Opalach, what have I done here? Like this. So this is how it will look like. And we can use this to modulate the frequency of the first FM operator. So let's connect it to the FM input of the oscillator. And let's activate the depth envelope. So this envelope will control the depth amount of the modulation. And let's trigger the envelope again with a divided clock to the gate input of the oscillator. I have a clock divided by 2. And let's set a nice long envelope, so a long attack. Maybe no sustain, a bit more decay. And let's raise the depth amount. Let's see first of all the way up how it sounds like. Let's take it a bit down. Very nice. Very nice. Okay, now there's another thing I want to show you. So let's add another rampage and set it up as an oscillator. So again, the range to the shortest range, cycle mode, and trigger it. And let's tune it real quickly. So let's again use hot tuner. Let's tune it again to C3, so it's about here. Very nice. And let's turn off the cycle mode. So I want to show you how we can set up a one-shot oscillator or a gated oscillator by sending a trigger to both trigger and cycle inputs. So let's use the manual gate module from Bog Audio, which is this one here, and send it to both trigger input and the cycle input. And let's take the square wave output, the rising output to the mixer. Let's take just the volume maybe a bit down. And now each time I trigger this function generator will get the oscillator sound, and when I let it go, the sound will go away. Let's raise the volume a bit more. So this way you can create gated sounds and oscillators with Rampage, and you can use it with a sequencer, for example, that will send a gate both to the trigger and to the cycle CV inputs. So this I just want to show you really quickly. And now let's see how we can use Rampage in more interesting ways. Okay, and let's see how we can use Rampage as a slew limiter. Now a slew limiter will take a signal and limit its output per second. So what we can achieve with this is creating smoother signals with rounder edges. And let's see this on a scope for a second. So let's add the scope. And let's use also the manual gate module from Bog Audio. Very nice, and connect it once directly to the scope and once through Rampage, through the signal input of Rampage, and then again to the scope. Let's separate the signals a bit. The blue trace will be the original signal, and the red or pinkish trace will be what's coming out of Rampage. And let's trigger this so we can see, let's take the time of the scope a bit down. So we can see this is the sort of signal we get, a square shape signal. Of course, it's a gate. And what we can do by using the rise and fall times, we can create slew limiting. So let's take the rise a bit, let's say somewhere here, and trigger it. So you can see it takes time until the gate is reaching its highest point. We can also do the same with the fall time. So now when I let go, it takes also time until it reaches the end. Very nice. And of course we can also change the shape, so we can make the fall more exponential and the fall more logarithmic, and the attack or the rise more exponential, or the other way around. Very cool. So this is what's called slew limiting. Rampage will limit the level of the signal, converting it into something less rough. Now what can we do with this? Well, first of all, I think the most common use of slew limiters is to create portamento or glide between notes. Let's get rid of this here. So let's see how we can do something like this. And we have here the fundamental sequencer. It's set to a 7-step sequence. And I also have the values here already set up. And let's again use the quantizer from JW. Very nice. And send the first row of the sequencer through the quantizer to the signal input of Rampage. Let's just initialize Rampage. Very nice. And let's use the triple even VCO from Squinky Labs. This will be our voice, the EV3. It's actually the even VCO from Befaco, but 3 of those in one module. So let's send this voltage to its volt per octave input to the first oscillator. And let's take the octaves a bit down. Very nice. And also to the scope. So let's again, the blue trace will be our original voltage. You can see it's a stepwise motion. And let's connect to the scope also the output from Rampage. Very nice. And now let's change the rise and time fall. No, let's change just the rise time to something like this. So every time the pitch will go up, there will be a glide. Let's listen to this also. Let's connect the first oscillator to the mixer. Oh yeah. So we can hear it and also see it on the scope. When the pitch of the oscillator is going up, there is a glide or portamento. We can also change its shape. And let's do the same also for the second row and the second oscillator. So we'll just duplicate the quantizer, take the second row from the quantizer to the signal input of the B section of Rampage, and from there to the volt per octave input of the second oscillator. Let's take also the octaves here down, and let's send this also to the mixer. And this time let's take the fall time a bit up. So every time the pitch is going down, there will be portamento or glide. And also here we can change the shape. Very nice. Now we have more outputs here, the minimum, maximum, and we can use them also. And we can also change the balance between A and B. Let's leave it somewhere here. And for this, I will want to create a sort of a bass voice. So let's use the third oscillator and take the octaves down, way down. And we will use a square wave. So let's change this to square. But I will also want, let's take the scope here. I will also want to filter this wave. And actually we can use Rampage also for this, also for low pass filtering signals. So let's just duplicate Rampage and initialize it. And let's send the square wave to the signal, again, the signal input of Rampage, and change the range to fast. So now with using the rise and fall sliders, we can sort of filter the signal. So let's see, let's add first of all another quantizer, because I want to use the maximum output here to generate notes. So we'll take the maximum output. Let's see this also on the scope. This is how it will look like. Let's take it to the quantizer, and from the quantizer to the volt per octave input of the third oscillator. Very nice. And let's take now the output from Rampage to the mixer. And now again, by using rise and fall, I can sort of filter the signal. I can change also its shape. Let's see this also on the scope, why not? So this is the original shape. This is how it looks like originally. Let's take the scale a bit down. And this is what's coming out of Rampage. So you can see can create a sort of a sawtooth wave. I can change its shape. But if I take both of them up, you can see that the shape is becoming smoother somehow, or somewhat smoother. And this is what creates this filter effect. So let's do this. We can also use the B section of this rampage to modulate the cutoff point, let's say, of this filter. So let's set it up as an LFO. Again, let's turn it into cycle mode, trigger it, maybe use a longer range. Let's see this also on the scope. Very nice. Let's make it a slower LFO. Something like this, maybe change its shape also. So now we can use this to modulate the cutoff point, let's say, of the filter that we've created with Rampage. But if we look at the scope now, we can see that the range of this LFO signal is going from 0 to positive 10 volts. So this is way too much for what I want. I want just to modulate the cutoff point a bit. And there are a few ways we can approach this. First of all, if we want a bipolar signal, so a signal that will go from -5 to +5 volts, for example. Let me just mute this for a second. We can of course use the dual attenuverter, also from Befaco. It's this one here. So we can use this and attenuate the signal and invert it also and offset it and make it like this, so we have a bipolar signal. But there is another module that can achieve this really easily. It's called Rescale from AS. And we have 4 different inputs for different ranges. So we have -5 to +5 volts, -0 to +5, 0 to +10, and 1 volt per octave. In this case, we have 0 to +10, so we just connect it to this input and we choose the outcome we want. We have here a list of what each number means, and in this case, I want number 1, -5 to +5, and if we look at the output, we can see we have a bipolar signal, and this is really easy. If you need to convert your voltage from one thing to another, just use this module. It's really easy. But in this case, I'm happy with the unipolar signal and I just want to attenuate it slightly. So let's get rid of Rescale and use the dual attenuverter. And also here, of course, we can invert the signal and create bipolar LFOs, but for now we'll just attenuate it. So let's take this signal through the attenuverter to the exponential CV input of Rampage, because I will want to control both rise and fall together. And if you remember, the exponential input is inverted, which means more voltage, shorten the rise and fall times. So this is exactly what I want. I want the sort of filter to open. And let's open the attenuverter a bit and let's see how this sounds like. Just the bass. Yes. Very nice. Let's make some space here. Okay, now we can use the slew limiter function to convert also a stepwise modulation source to a somewhat smoother signal. So let's use kinks, for example. For mutable or audible instruments, it's called utilities. And let's trigger the sample and hold section with the gate output of the sequencer. Very nice, and let's see this on the scope. So this is what we get. This is the sample and hold signal we get, stepwise motion. Now this we can change with Rampage. So let's add another Rampage. It's down here somewhere. Let's initialize it. And let's send the sample and hold signal to its signal input. And then let's connect this to the scope. So again, the red trace will be after Rampage. Let's take it a bit up, and now I can change it to a somewhat smoother signal by raising the rise and fall times. Somewhere here maybe. Very nice. And now we can use this signal to modulate all sorts of things. In this case, let's modulate the pulse width of the square wave. So let's take this signal from Rampage to the PWM input of the third oscillator, which outputs a square wave. And let's open the attenuverter. Very nice. So now we have, let's see this again on the scope. So now we have a smoother random generated or randomly generated signal, but it's smooth, it's not stepwise like a sample and hold. And we can use this for all sorts of things. Okay, so this was Rampage as a slew limiter and Rampage as a filter. Okay, so there is one more thing I wanted to show you, and that is how to add distortion to your sound. Nice, crunchy distortion using Rampage. What I have here, I have the topograph from Valley. It's actually grids from Mutable Instruments. It's generating a drum loop. I have here closed hats, open hats, snare, and tremor as our kick. Tremor from Volt. This is how it sounds like. Topograph is amazing for stuff like this, for creating really interesting rhythms and loops. So all of the channels, the hats and the snare and the kick, I'm mixing into a stereo channel, and this is going once to the rest of the mixer so we can hear it, and it's going again, or it's going once more to Rampage, also to the signal inputs of Rampage A and B. And what I've done here, I took the rising outputs. You can choose rising or falling, never mind. But I took, in this case, the rising outputs and I sent them to another stereo channel. And what this will do, it will turn the signal or the wave, it will turn it into square waves. So what we get is a nice clipping distortion sound, and this will sound like this. Ooh, yeah. And we can change the range of Rampage to make it more subtle, maybe. Something like this. Again, this is without. Quite boring. And now with. Yes. And what I also have here, I have utilities, kinks again from Audible Instruments. It's receiving a trigger, the sample and hold section is receiving a trigger from Clocked. And I'm going to send the output, the sample and hold output, to modulate the exponential CV of both channels. So we get some modulation. Yeah. We can also turn cycle mode on. And very nice. We can use the comparator output to make this for us. Yes. Very cool. So you can see it's really interesting sound, really interesting distortion going on. I have here two even VCOs. They receive pitch information from the phrase sequencer, a short arpeggiator, nothing fancy. They are going through a VCA to the mixer, and Rampage here, another Rampage, is modulating the VCA or the level of the oscillators. So I'm using output A to modulate the level of the oscillators and output B as an LFO to modulate the pulse width of the oscillators. They are outputting square waves. So let's listen to how this sounds like. It's going also through a reverb. Yes. Now let me add a scope shortly. And what we get here from the rising output, we get, you can see this, we get a sort of gates or triggers, depends how long they are. And what we can do, we can modulate also here the exponential CV input. Let's do it again with the sample and hold. So we get the envelope is being modulated, the fall and the rise. And what we get now are also random gates. And what I've done here, I sent noise from kinks to the VCA, from the VCA to the mixer, and the rising output, those random gates are modulating the VCA, so we get this. Yes. This is crazy. Let's take the distortion out. Pretty boring with distortion. Yes. Wow. This is crazy. So you see, you can use Rampage and all of a sudden a lot of possibilities, a lot of different worlds are opening up. I know it's VCV Rack, I know we can use as many modules as our computer allows us. But do yourselves a favor, next time you need an envelope generator, next time you need an LFO, use Rampage. It will open up so many possibilities. So many interesting things you can do to your patch or to your patches. And I think that's it. I mean, of course, there are a lot of other things we can do with Rampage. Maybe it will come also in future videos. But I think this is enough for now. This was Rampage from Befaco. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe and hit the bell. And have a good one.